Dr. Michael Staley, one of my heroes in our community with the information that he's been gathering, the research he's been doing. And so we'll go ahead and turn the time over to him with the research that he's, the information he'll share.
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to be here. I have the unfortunate position of making you late to lunch if I talk too long, which is pretty dangerous. Run amok here. So I called my talk today Safe Harbors, Deep Waters, and I'm going to give you an update on suicide mortality in Utah so that you know the problem maybe a little bit better. But then I'm going to talk about recent data from two different projects that I've been working on at the Office of the Medical Examiner where I work. We are a very unique state in that we have a centralized medical examiner, and also that a position like mine exists within the medical examiner's office, somebody to do research and surveillance on suicide mortality. We also have the similar program for accidental overdose surveillance as well. But this also affords me the really unique honor of speaking to families after they experience these devastating losses. And there's no silver lining, but we can learn from people who have sadly died by suicide. And before I continue, I want to say that no one is exempt from a crisis. And so 988 is for you too. If you don't have that number in your phone, I guess you don't really have to do that. No one forgets 911, but neither should you forget 988. I call this number because I'm worried about somebody that I just interviewed or a friend, and I just want to run it by somebody who deals with these kinds of crises all the time. You know, like, what should I do next? Crisis brain, all of the things that we're talking about leave our head, and so 988 is that good fallback. I also want you to know that it's not lost on me that every single one of these deaths is the tragedy of a lifetime for a family, a community, a church congregation, and I aggregate them together. That's what I do as an epidemiologist, and that sometimes feels kind of cold. But again, I know the weight of each one of these really horrible tragedies. You're looking at a chart of suicide in Utah over the last 23 years, since 1999. And the colors, they do show up. Sometimes they don't. The top line there is the rate, and that's probably the most significant thing to look at. And we thought, so we saw this big increase for a very long time, and then sometime around 2017, things really started to level off in Utah. And that's a dangerous thing to say, because they leveled off in a really bad place, at a really high number, a high rate. And then we saw these modest decreases for several years in a row, and then enter 2022, and this data has not yet been publicly released for our state, but will be shortly, and we saw these pretty significant increases. For the first time, more than 700 people in Utah died by suicide in a single year. We thought we would see some kind of increase like this in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we started meeting weekly with our partners at Intermountain and the University of Utah and health departments and across the state to start talking about this and monitoring these things in really granular detail. And the truth of the thing is that we kind of knew even back in March 2020 that we probably wouldn't realize the worst of the pandemic in mental health for 2 or more years after the event itself. After the Great Recession in 2008, we really didn't see those huge spikes in suicide until 2011. After 9/11, September 11th, suicide plummeted for a period of time, particularly for those who lived in New York, and we didn't see those increase for years afterwards. And so I think even though the evidence that I'm showing you today doesn't really point to this directly, I think what we're seeing here is the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, because we were all experiencing something together for a while, and not all of us are recovering the same way. This is just a zoom in on that last 5 years. This is suicide by sex, males and females. The dotted lines there are the national rates for males and females. We saw increases in 2022 for both males and females, but the increase among males was greater. And I think that is largely explained by suicide method, which I'm going to get to in just a minute. You've probably heard this if you've ever taken an intro to psychology class or an intro to sociology class, but nationally males die by suicide at a 3-to-1 ratio male to female, and you flip that on its head for suicide morbidity, non-fatal attempt. As I say that, there's a lot of complication in that, even though that's been true for a long time, because the greatest single predictor of a fatal suicide attempt is a previous suicide attempt. And that holds true even more so given the more recent data that I'm going to show you here today. When I started this job, white non-Hispanic adults were by and large at the greatest risk, and not by a little, but by a lot. But in just a short period of time over the last 6 years, we've seen rates among Black African American Utahns and among Pacific Islanders, and to a lesser degree, but still among Hispanic and Latino Utahns as well. And now these are virtually the same rate as white non-Hispanic Utahns. The other group here that I want to point out that saw pretty exponential, or not exponential, but really big increases is the American Indian and Alaska Native group. This used to be virtually the same as white non-Hispanic Utahns, but has now about 1.7 times greater, and that's statistically higher. So this is a group of Utahns that we need strategic plans to address suicide in those communities that are culturally competent. The other group that we talk about frequently is veterans and service members. In Utah, the Pew Research estimates that about 5.2% of Utahns identify as a veteran or an active service member. And yet, out of all the people who die by suicide every year in Utah, about 12% of them are veterans, which is about twice as likely as non-service members, non-veterans. We have the governor's challenge to prevent suicide in our state. That was a step in the right direction. We have a specific state coordinator for that. The National Guard has got folks, Ken Francis and others, who do really great work. And we also know that when we identify veterans who are experiencing a suicidal crisis, getting them care from the VA reduces their likelihood of suicide attempt by half. No other program out there really shows that level of success. I'm going to talk about suicide method on the whole here for just a second. Firearm-related suicides account for the vast majority of suicides in our state, and this is not new. For a very long time, 20 plus years, half of all suicides in our state have involved a firearm. I don't know what happened to the label there. Oh, it got moved up. You never know. You put it in the machine and it comes out some other way, right? So this is concerning though. In March 2020, we saw gun sales across the nation surge, not just a little, but like almost double in some regards. And we know that a lot of households were getting a firearm for the first time in that period. And we know that when people are in crisis, access to a firearm is a really dangerous situation. This is 2022 data that you're looking at. In 2021, the proportion of people who used a firearm to die by suicide rose to 57% in our state. Fell a little bit again in 2022, but this number is so stable over time that any change in it really draws my attention. Now, this kind of might seem like, boy, what do we do with that? Actually, I think there's more opportunity here than we know about. I'm going to talk about that towards the end of my talk today. If you Google suicide in Utah, you're going to get a return from your search engine that's about 40% of the articles, maybe even half, are going to be about youth suicide, and then the rest will be, maybe about the general population or something like that. And I'm not measuring tragedy here, not at all. But epidemiologically, that's how I measure suicide. Youth account for about 6% of suicide deaths each year. And youth are those that we call 0 to 17 years old. That's roughly the smallest age group of any other age group that we track, which is all of them. Suicide is an issue that spans the life course. And kind of what we saw in SARS-CoV-1, that's the precedent to COVID-19 in Asia, we saw pretty big increases among older adults. And we're seeing that here in Utah now. the 75 plus, 65 plus age groups used to account for between 2 and 3% of all suicide deaths each year, and are now accounting for more like 6 to 7, even 8% every year. So a lot of older folks go to church. And so I'm pleading with you to have a strategy to talk with the older folks in your congregation about suicide, not just the young folks or the middle-aged folks, even though middle-aged adults are still at the highest risk of suicide. I'm going to talk now about findings from 2 different projects that I've been working on at the medical examiner's office for the last couple of years. The first is the Youth Suicide Research Project, and I'm not going to get really in the weeds here, but I'm just a little bit, so you have to bear with me. And also results from a surveillance system called the Sudden and Unexpected Death Surveillance System, which we call SUDS. So first, the youth study, just a little bit about it. It's a 2-phase study of individuals who are between the ages of 10 and 17, and we include 18-year-olds who are still in high school or just had graduated, who died by suicide between 2016 and 2019, and who were Utah residents or who had been living in Utah for 3 or more months at the time that they died. We had about 100, that left us with about 203 10 to 17-year-olds in this 4-year period. And out of that 203, 108 families agreed to speak to us, which is a 53% response rate. In social science, that's pretty good. These are a highly invested group of parents, as you might well expect. And so sometimes we were only able to speak to the parents, other times we were able to speak to as many as 4 or 5 of their friends, and we had to stop and say, I know you all want to talk to us, but we have to move on to the next case. So right now we're in the analysis and publication phase of this study. The second project, which is I'm going to present the information related to adults here, is from the Sudden and Unexpected Death Surveillance System, or SUDS. This is just one interview that we conduct within 4 to 8 months after a certification of a death. And we just talk to one person, usually a spouse or a parent, sometimes a sibling. Most of these were parents, by the way, followed by spouses. And we just try to fill in the gaps in knowledge. You know, what about this person do we need to know to do better prevention? But also, how did this person arrive at their suicide? This is also, as the other interviews are too, an opportunity for us to get a hold of families who are experiencing great amounts of distress and to steer the ship in a slightly better direction, to shift them away from the Jack Daniels responses towards specific grief resources for people who lost somebody to suicide. And I take a great deal of pride in knowing that we are leaving these folks just a little bit better than we found them. So, and we continue to do these interviews. We just passed, I think, right around 1,100 of these interviews, and I'm presenting results from the first 950 of them here. So I'm going to shift gears and just talk a little bit about religion and suicide, because that is the topic of this conference. And this is data, by the way, that I have not shared before. But here's how suicidologists think about religion. We think of it as a big umbrella, as a protective factor, meaning it's something that prevents people from engaging in a suicide attempt or taking their own life. But to break that down a little bit further, it falls into 3 big domains. Religious integration, which is, how am I belonging in this community? And does this community belong to me back? Religious commitment. Do I believe the things that I profess to believe by attending and participating in this congregation? And religious networks, meaning I have friends at church, and church affords me, or my congregation affords me, connection to other people, other opportunities, that kind of thing. And lastly, I'm including this moral community hypothesis, because this is something that we're thinking about, which is the idea that if you're in a highly religious community, that there's a blanket protection effect for all people who live in that community, regardless of their participation in a specific congregation or any congregation. And for Utah, who has a really high participation rate in religion, this might apply to us more so than many other states. So I went to the grad school at the University of New Hampshire, and I felt like I really was the only person going to church on Sunday, most Sundays. But, so it's a very different shift back to Utah. So of 162 sociological studies on religion, and suicide over 117 years, from 1882 to 2008, 133 of those studies found that religion was a protective factor against suicide. And 29 studies showed that religion was neither a protective nor a risk factor for suicide. It was neutral. And I would say that my data probably kind of lands in this 29 category a little bit, with some mixed results here and there. But I also want to point out that for LGBTQ people, for whom they said religion was very important to them, religion actually was a risk factor for suicide ideation, attempt, and reporting ever have attempted suicide. Meaning they were more likely to have thought about suicide or report a suicide attempt. But if they said religion was not important to them and they identified as part of a religious congregation, it made no difference. So these are, another blanket statement here. Pew Research estimates that 77% of Utahns belong to a religious congregation, and that 61% say that they're absolutely certain that there is a God. 58% say that religion is very important in their life. So suicide prevention for youth, this is from the youth study, belongs in congregation, and when people leave congregations too. 44% of youth who died by suicide were reported by their friends and family to be a member of a religious congregation at the time that they died. 54% were not. 53% attended church 2 to 3 times per month or more at the time that they died, and 20% were told by a religious leader that they could not participate in some religious activity or activities of some sort. 73, we also ask if they say no, they weren't a member of a religion at the time that they died. We ask, well, were they ever part of a religious congregation? And 73% said yes. So there's this gap here. So we answered yes if they answered yes to question 1 and then answered yes to question 2. But what this tells us is that there are a lot of young people in this group who are under the age of 18 that experience some kind of faith transition. And that may be a big opportunity for us here today to provide additional support. And thank you, Dr. Halverson, for that. That really gave me a way to engage in this idea and talking about faith transitions, because this is an opportunity. There are risk factors that we can't change, and there are risk factors that we can. And this is one of those that we can. Utahns who died by suicide, this is for adults, and it's surprisingly a lot like the youth. But Utahns who died by suicide were less likely to be a member of a religious congregation than the general population. 44% of adults were members of a religious congregation at the time of their death. 41% of these folks had not attended a religious service in the past year. And I want to come back to that in just a second. But 23, almost 24%, said that they attended church twice per month or more. So these are typically more highly engaged people. And almost 20% went at least every week. Almost 70% said that they were part of a religious congregation at some point in their life. Again, 70% and then 44%. So that means that about 26% of these people had experienced a faith transition at some point in their life. We're not as good about measuring this in the general population, so I don't really have a good comparison group, but that's a pretty big number and a pretty big opportunity with adults as well. And so there's a qualitative data set that goes with this quantitative data set, and we haven't really dug into this a whole lot, but I did just look at some of the notes to these kinds of questions, because these are all open-ended, semi-structured questions that we're asking. But these comments fall into, we ask, so when did they disaffiliate? And why did they disaffiliate? And it kind of falls into 3 big categories, and COVID plays part of this story, but they were too ill or physically unable to attend church, so they just eventually stopped going and eventually disaffiliated. Remember that it's important that you feel that you belong in your congregation, but that your congregation belongs you back. This, to me, we're sending up when people become housebound or they can't go to church or whatever the case might be. If we're not going to them and meeting them where they are because of an illness, for example, then we have unbelonged them and they have not unbelonged us. The COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of people didn't like virtual church. I know my grandparents fit into that category. My grandma, how am I going to receive communion through this thing on my table now? So she just stopped, and she hasn't been back. And, she does like a casserole for a funeral, but that's not the same thing as belonging to a community. And so we know that the COVID-19, and I know there are a lot of pastors and clergy in the room, and you don't need me to tell you this, but COVID-19 was a really big challenge, and we're still dealing with that challenge. And lastly, this disaffiliation was associated with a transition to adulthood. So this was a disaffiliation that happened long in the past. Some of these were related to some kind of traumatic event or identity or something like that, but this was something that happened when they turned 18 and just stopped going to church. Marriage is one of those things like religion that we say protects against suicide, and our data shows that very, very strongly. So people who died by suicide were more likely to be single and not partnered in any way. They were more likely to be divorced, and they were more likely to be married and separated. Of that married and separated group, which looks relatively small, that's a really high-risk group. This is the divorced group, this divorce could have happened 2 years ago, it could have happened last month, it could have happened 20 years ago. It's just their most recent relationship status. But with this married separated group, most of these separations occurred within 2 weeks of the death. This is a really vulnerable time. And it's a vulnerable time for youth, by the way, as well. 56% of them were on the verge or had just been broken up with or on the verge of a breakup. So that's, again, an opportunity place for us to pay attention. What's interesting, though, is that we asked, well, for people who are religious and people who are not religious, so remember 54-44, relationship status does not differ significantly by religious status at the time of death. So religion might not actually protect all that much when somebody, versus marriage or relationships. We didn't see any specific differences with a lot of different things that I kind of expected to. In sociology, we generally think about people as people who are engaged and people who are not, and everything in between, connected and unconnected. And I kind of thought there would be sort of this unconnected group that would just really rise to the top of risk in our data. And it turns out that people who belong to a religious congregation were about at the same levels of proportions whether or not they saw a physician, or had a chronic health diagnosis or a mental health diagnosis, or complained about being in physical pain, or had received some kind of treatment for mental illness. These were roughly the same between the religious group and the not religious group. There were some differences, though. 80% of suicide victims who were a member of a religious congregation at the time of their death drank alcohol. There's a lot of people who were hiding their drinking, frankly, from even their spouses, and they found out after they had passed away. And I want to just talk about alcohol very briefly, because it's something that's sort of this foundational underlining thing that just elevates risk tremendously. There is just this really volatile situation that emerges: relationship conflict, alcohol, and easy access to a firearm. Those three in trifecta are a recipe for disaster. So I'm going to come back to firearms, like I said, in just a minute. But that alcohol reduces inhibitions. It accelerates things much faster than we'd like them to be. That reasoning and logic goes out the window, and we end up in this bad situation. They were equally as likely to be using an illicit drug at the time of their death. But families members who were more likely to be the victim's drug use as dependents among the religious group than the non-religious victims. So people who were not a member of a religious congregation, their family said, yeah, well, they're using illicit drugs, but they weren't just convinced that they were dependent on that drug as the religious group. This is a question that we didn't ask them. This is a question I'm asking you. Is your congregation a safe place for a member to tell someone that they're feeling suicidal? So suicide victims who are not members of a religious congregation at the time of their death were slightly more likely to have told someone that they were suicidal prior to dying by suicide than those who did not belong to a religious congregation at the time of their death. But religious and non-religious suicide victims were about equally as likely to have had a previous non-fatal suicide attempt. I don't know the reasons why the religious group had lower proportions of talking about suicide. It could have been something entirely unrelated to their congregation, but the thing that came right to my head was, are there people in your congregation who are safe to go to tell this really vulnerable thing? What happens if somebody comes to you, or what happens if you go to somebody and you say, I'm thinking about taking my own life? Lights and sirens, people are gonna come and take me to the hospital, and that needs to be, we need to send the message that that could be what happens, not lights and sirens, but that we care for you, that we love you, and we're gonna be with you every step of the way. And going to an ED is not the right response for all people who are saying that they're having thoughts of suicide. Some people might be in therapy. Some people might have been thinking about suicide for years, and they're just telling this to you now because they want you to be a safe person and to know what they're going through. For other people, this might be an imminent crisis, and that requires more direct action. So we have to talk about firearm safety, even at church. And that might be really uncomfortable. If you're not used to talking about firearms, this can be especially uncomfortable. We had this conversation. It started with physicians and care providers in healthcare settings and primary care doctors, and saying, for those patients that you see that are at higher risk of suicide, we need you to engage in a conversation with them about reducing their access to their firearms, whether that means locking them up, removing the ammunition, taking some part of that firearm out of it and giving it to a trusted friend, or the best scenario yet is having a trusted friend or family member hold that firearm for a period of time until this rough spot, we get through it. Because people who were religious and not religious died by firearm almost at the same exact proportions. This is how you get training on that. By the way, we just got legislation passed last year that will allow educators to engage in talking with families about keeping their homes safe by reducing access to lethal means, firearms, and large amounts of medications over the counter or prescribed. And so I really think that you guys are the next frontier, the clergy, the people who go to church. So this Intermountain Health is a counseling on access to lethal means. It's a course. If you're a healthcare provider, you get continuing education credits for that. And there's also these firearm resources from the Utah Suicide Prevention Coalition as well. There are YouTube videos, flyers, and what to do and how to have that conversation. And this is not, I want to be clear that this is not, a Second Amendment's argument at all. This is just simply about keeping people safe. And when the rough patch passes, then get your firearms back. Postvention, how many of you have heard that word before, postvention? Okay, postvention, basically suicide prevention has three parts. Suicide prevention, the stuff that we do upstream like building coping and resilience. It has intervention, things like going to a doctor and getting help or seeing a therapist. And then postvention, what happens after somebody who dies by suicide or has a serious suicide attempt, or really any suicide attempt. And that is, how do we take care of them and bring them back into our community in really specific ways. This is a little different with suicide than it is just general bereavement, because there's a lot more guilt that's really documented in the research among families who survive the loss of someone close to suicide. But postvention belongs in our congregations, and Dr. Supiano, who is one of my heroes, is speaking this afternoon to you about that. Suicide loss survivors who are more likely to be a member of a religious congregation were more likely to cope better in the wake of a suicide loss. Meaning they were, 6 months out, 8 months out, they were doing just a little bit better than the group that didn't belong to, or were less likely to belong to a religious congregation. So we have to get educated and provide this really informed, careful, and compassionate support to loss survivors. And that is prevention. When we disrupt this cycle, Dr. Kuhn's research at the University of Utah shows that suicide is somewhere between 1% and 50% heritable, meaning like heart disease and other kinds of things, we inherit some part of that risk, whether that be impulsivity and character traits like that, or something else that we don't know about yet. But we can disrupt that. We're not powerless just because it's genetic or epigenetics. We can engage in that and we can disrupt that cycle. So I'm really excited that that kind of tees up Dr. Supiano's talk for this afternoon. And turns out I flew through that. So we won't be late to lunch after all, but I am absolutely willing to take questions. Yes.
How easy is it to get a firearm?
Generally speaking, well, I think it's fairly easy. I mean, so unless you're on a restricted list from a felony conviction that's still on your record or something like that, it's very easy, plus the cost, whatever, to get a firearm. But there are very few barriers to obtaining a firearm.
I just say that because we had a person die of suicide in our community and they had already taken firearms away.
So tragic. And that's not all just, just to repeat the question, or repeat the statement that the person who asked the question stated that they had just removed the firearms from somebody and then they obtained another firearm, and that's what they used in their fatal suicide attempt. And I won't say that that's uncommon, sadly. Some people don't, though, and those are the ones that we never hear about after the firearms are removed. But also, I would just say that there's another tool that just came online, and that's a voluntary no-buy list that Representative Elison sponsored during the last session. So people can put their name on a no-buy list, meaning they are on the same list when they go to a gun dealer that says this person can't buy a firearm. It doesn't tell them why they can't buy a firearm, but it would just say, in that crisis, they can't get a firearm. They can do that for like 180 days, or they can put it on there for a longer period of time. It's their choice. But we're really trying to educate healthcare providers to use that voluntary no-buy list. And it's something that I'm not really fully up to speed on how lay people can use that, but I do believe there are ways for that to happen. It's just paperwork. Yes. I think there's links on both that will eventually, all roads lead to Rome in this situation, but the Intermountain one's more direct, the first one on that slide. The one on your left. Yes.
Yes, what I have seen, I would like to know in your research, I see for the different type of suicidals, it seems to be the element. Have you seen in your research a common thread to all those suicidals?
So the question, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the question was, have we seen a common thread with all people who die by suicide? No. Suicide is a wicked problem, and this is a really hard thing to talk about, particularly with policymakers who want something that is a Band-Aid for everything. And that will not exist in suicide prevention. I'm going to give you an example. There's a really novel suicide method, I'm not going to name it, but that probably maybe 6 or so people die by suicide using that method every year in Utah. And we could restrict the sale of that thing online so that it had to be purchased in person. And I tried to pitch that to a policymaker, and it was kind of like, well, maybe we're interested, maybe we're not. It didn't really go anywhere, because I think when I said, well, how many deaths could this prevent? Well, up to 6. And they look at the number 640, or last year 717, and they say, well, I don't know, is that really worth passing legislation for? And I would say absolutely yes, because suicide prevention is not something that we're going to pass 2 or 3 bills to reduce the suicide rate. we're going to chip away at it a death or two or 6 or 10 at a time. And if we happen upon something really big that reduces suicide death by 20 or 50, wow, we just hit the jackpot. Because people die by suicide for all kinds of reasons. Some people are suicidal for years and then they die by suicide. Other people are suicidal for a matter of 5 seconds and they die by suicide. And so our opportunity to intervene is different. The reasons that they're in that position are different. And gosh, boy, do I wish we could find that thing that we could pitch to a legislator or healthcare systems that would just bring those numbers down and prevent those deaths. Yeah.
So my first question is really short. What was the population when you were talking 6% of 0 to 17-year-olds die by suicide, I think it was, and then it went to the 65 plus, 75 plus was 2 to 3%. So what made up the whole?
That's the population of Utah.
Okay, thank
Yeah.
you. And then my next question was, so I work in education, and there are often times where they say that, oh, we don't want to talk about suicide if something happened sometimes, just because we don't want it to be replicated or whatever. Is there research out there that's strong that talks about that happening? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Does talking about suicide plant the idea of suicide? And the answer to that is it's complicated, but generally no. It's safer to talk about suicide. And somebody who's having suicidal thoughts, and there's lots of good research to support this, somebody who's thinking about suicide is not going to suddenly start thinking about suicide because you ask them, are you thinking about suicide? That's a pretty big myth. There is one caveat, and there's a safe messaging training that is put on every so often by Office of Substance Use and Mental Health. Andrea Hood, who's sitting back there, is the author of that. One of my favorite trainings ever, actually, about talking about suicide safely. You'll notice that I just talked about a suicide method that 6 people-ish die. I didn't give you that method. That's that safe messaging guideline. Because somebody who's already vulnerable, who's thinking about suicide, if we talk to them about specific suicide methods, or about people who died by suicide, or somebody who died by suicide is in a better place, that's not safe messaging. We're saying that suicide is a relief for whatever the challenges that you're facing right now, and that's not the message that we want to send at all. So generally, I would never want people to say, I can't talk about suicide because it might not be safe. Err on the side of talking about suicide, but also there's ways to do that safely. Yeah, in the back.
I had a question on, I don't know if you can go back to the slides with the percentages, but there was saw some percentages that those that were religious and went generally, and then there were others that were disaffiliated. I started doing the math, and there we are. The 44% of adults were members of religious congregation, and then we also had there was another one that talked about being disaffiliated. And I started doing the math, and it's a lot higher than 100%. Are these percentages of subgroups?
Yep. There's always an engineer in every crowd, right? Thank you for pointing that out.
Could you clarify
Yes.
Clarify
Yep.
which percentage is a subgroup and which percentage is of the total?
Absolutely. Good question. 44% is of the total. So on this slide, that's about 949 is the big group here. And then we took that 44%, said that they were members of a religious congregation at time of death. And then we looked at that and said 41% of that 44% had not attended religion in the past year. And that 23% is that same subgroup as well. And there's also an unknown here that also causes the boundaries of this to sometimes not add correctly, but unknown is where it's big and it matters. I talk about it directly, but otherwise it's just sort of the margins.
I'm sorry if I didn't understand well, but in the statistic, when you show the female and male from Utah and from the total USA's, Utah is over the average, this one.
Yep. That's right. Utah has had a higher rate of suicide for since 1999, since we started using the set of ICD codes, but actually really back to the 1950s and 60s, we've had higher rates of suicide in Utah. Ever since we've had a centralized medical examiner system since 1961, we know that to be true. I think what's kind of notable here to me is that our rates have been increasing nationally. They increased about 30% between 1999 and 2020 nationally, but in Utah they increased more. For example, among youth between 2011 and 2015, among youth they increased by 141%. So it varies by different age groups, it varies by sex, but the suicide rate increased much faster in Utah post 2008 and really starting in 2011 than the rest of the country. And by the way, I just want to add, I couldn't put the rest of the states here because they don't have their 2022 data ready yet, but Colorado, Wyoming, Idaho, Montana, New Mexico, Nevada, they all have higher rate, Alaska, they all consistently are right with us in that top 10. It's an Intermountain West problem. Yes, the gray shirt.
Yeah, I understand we're talking about best practices around suicide prevention. Have you seen any research that parses out active ideation versus passive ideation as a way of, I understand like having the conversations, having the help, having the support, but is there any research that you know of that helps us identify like who might be urgently, that more active danger?
The traditional way of doing this is to ask, are you thinking about suicide? Well, no, but I do sometimes. That's fairly passive. But really the question that is on the balance here is, do you have a plan? And how likely are you to engage in that plan? I think that the research is honestly a little bit mixed right now about that. I think it's one of the best tools we have at this point. But I also think QPR or youth mental health first aid or mental health first aid are all really good courses to take to help you navigate that situation. Because oftentimes it's about how did we get here to this, or what happens when you think about taking your own life? And what do we do at step A when you start to feel that way? When you start to feel your breathing become shallow or your palms become sweaty? What are the things that you can do right in that moment to turn that back so that because somebody who's passively suicidal, who maybe has years of occasionally experiencing thoughts of suicide, we know that they might become suicidal again, and that switches, and helping them identify what it is within themselves that's changing, and to do a U-turn on that, to de-escalate, I think is really the best strategy. But in that moment, do you have a plan? Are you going to act on it? If they answer yes to either one of those, it's time to call 988. Yep. And honestly, this is such a gray area. This is why I call 988, because it's like, well, they answered yes to this and no to that and yes to this, but then they changed their mind halfway through and then they changed their mind again, and I'm like, I just need to consult with somebody. And I've been surprised. Sometimes I've called them and they're like, yeah, they're fine. They'll be okay. They've got some good strategies. And other times when I'm like, I think they're gonna be okay, they're like, no, we need MCOT there now. So again, it's good to consult with somebody else. Yes.
Question on the data. Did it show, or did you ask how many of those families or people knew that they were suicidal versus those who didn't know?
We asked in both groups, did they ever talk about suicide? And so that would be, one of the ways that we would measure that, or if they ever had a history of a suicide attempt. It's about 30% in both groups, little higher. Well, 36 in one and 34% in youth, I think. But yeah, it's a little over a third. Yeah. And there was he left, I think. Oh, right here.
Okay, for years there's been a correlation between the Intermountain West and higher suicide rates. Are there studies going on? Is there anything? Correlation isn't necessarily high, but you may know there's been, maybe it's the altitude that does not.
Yeah. Well, turns out you're probably gonna be late for lunch because she just asked a really big question. There's a lot of working theories, and some of them with evidence and some of them with not as great evidence. That you asked generally about altitude. Altitude is definitely something that shows up in studies. It's statistically significant, particularly for people who are experiencing depression. It's sometimes at altitude, for some people, it's harder to treat depression using the tools that we currently have because they work with serotonin and the way that our brain absorbs serotonin. But if you look at their models, it explains about 1%, 1 to 2% of variance between places at altitude and places not at altitude. And our suicide rate is way more than 1% greater than the rest of the country. So that's part of it. And this is, again, a wicked problem, so there's multiple explanations. Number two is that there's higher rates of gun ownership in the West. And it's also more rural, which means it's harder to access care. If somebody goes to a very rural place in Montana, and I'm from Montana, so I can pick on them, there's one psychiatrist between Billings, Montana, and Miles City, Montana. How many of you have ever driven I-90 east to west? That is a long stinking ways for a psychiatrist to get called in the middle of the night to go to the ED in Sydney, Montana to treat that. So that's part of it as well. It's difficult to get care, plus easy access to highly lethal means. In Wyoming, about 73% of people who die by suicide use a firearm, greater even than in Utah. And then, let's see, rurality, easy access to gun. I think that's the big three. It's like I'm missing one, but those are some of the working hypotheses. I didn't. There's another one. Suicide diffusion and suicide contagion. And these are really some of the most recent additions to the sociological literature on suicide. But the idea, and we see this in our data, by the way, of those youth, 26% of them had a friend die by suicide before them. And out of that, about 10, which I don't know how the numbers quite, like 10, quantity 10, said their best friend died by suicide before they did. Somebody really close to them. This idea that suicide is a contagious idea. And what happens with that is that somebody sees a problem like theirs and they're like, my friend died by suicide and they had the same problems that I did. And therefore it becomes a more accessible mentally, more adopted way of dealing with the same set of problems. And so there's that's contagion. Then diffusion is this idea that once suicide, like coming to a group like this and saying that the rates of suicide are higher in our state carries a little bit of risk, according to this theory, because then it becomes that suicide is just more commonplace. There's some really good research in Colorado on that. Any other questions? Great. Well, thank you. It's one of my favorite conferences. Thanks.
Isn't he great? So grateful for Michael and his work. His work is groundbreaking, and he's pretty modest, but this research that he just shared with you is pretty much the first of its kind in the country. Maybe the world, I don't know, in the country. So we're super thankful for this research because it really gives us an idea of how we can better approach suicide deaths here in Utah and how to prevent more deaths. So thank you, Michael. So we have made it to lunch, and I know we are all so grateful to have this opportunity to visit and to chat and to discuss some of the things that we've talked about today. There are some discussion cards on your table. If you want to use them during lunch to get to know your neighbor and have more meaningful, maybe deeper dive into the content we've talked about today, please do. I want to highlight on your table, there is a flyer called Question, Persuade, and Refer for faith leaders. This is QPR training. This is a basic suicide prevention training. We are offering a couple different options for you and your faith community. We have one on November 2nd that will be in person in Lehigh, and the location is there, and you can email Carol or call Carol, or you can type this little registration link to go to registration. There is another one in St. George, so for you online or anyone who's come up here from St. George, we will be having a faith QPR training in St. George on the 7th of November. And it will be at the Select Health Auditorium. So anyway, you can look at that. And I have slides that are going to be playing in a minute, and you can get all this information on the slides, but I'm just telling you what it is. And lastly, we will be doing a virtual QPR training, so anybody, anywhere in this room or online can participate on November 7th at 6 p.m. There will be a Zoom registration link for that as well. This is an important basic suicide prevention training that every human on this planet needs to help prevent suicide. It's how we recognize the warning signs. It's how we ask the question. It's how we have those conversations. So I encourage you to take this training. And if you haven't, or even if you have, encourage your congregants to participate, because it is open for anyone, anywhere can utilize this. So next, before I let you go to lunch, I'm going to welcome Reverend Vanetta Goffin Wilkerson is going to come up and give us a blessing or a prayer for our lunch. And we were expecting Rabbi Spector. Oh, Rabbi Spector's here. Wonderful. From Kokioman. And I want to give him a blessing for being here. He's had a rough week, and we're so grateful that he's willing to be here with us today. So I will let Pastor Vanetta, if you would like to go first. Wonderful. Thank you.
Please pray with me. Creator of the universe, we gather in this place from our diverse perspectives and experiences of your divine love and your divine identity. Together we recognize and honor your presence, your power, your grace, and your mercy in this place. We ask that you abide in each of us by your Spirit in ways that we can feel and recognize. Abide in us in ways that remind us of your constant and consistent presence. Remind us and help us to remind our siblings there is no place where we can be where you are not there. There is no place that you don't see, feel, and understand our feelings, fears, and frustrations. Remind us that you will be with us as we take each step of our journey. Remind us in the highest heights you're there. In the depths of despair, all the way to the pits of hell, you are there. Remind us as each day dawns and when it sets, you are there. Remind us when we find ourselves cast adrift on the far side of our experience and what we understand, you are still there. Remind us in the times and places of our lives that seem to be without light or hope, you are there. We ask, O Lord, that you do what only you can do. By your hand, guide us and show us that we are held fast in your love. Grant that each of us, as we leave this place, is better equipped and able to share the power of your love and presence with those we encounter. Please bless each one to use their gifts, be it counseling, prayer, presence, or medicine, that through our gifts we may encourage those we encounter to live on. Finally, we give thanks for the food we are about to share. We ask your blessings on those who consume, those who grow and prepare, and those who provide. As Jesus Christ would pray, amen.
Thank you all. Just want to say, sorry I wasn't here the whole day. This has been a very tough week for me and my community. As I'm sure that many of you heard, on Saturday, in a senseless massacre, more Jews were killed in a single day since any day since the Holocaust. And my community, specifically my congregation, has received multiple bomb and death threats this week. And so what I'd say to all of you, just since this is a mental health summit, and particularly for people of faith, is your Jewish friends are not doing well right now. If you have a Jewish friend, please reach out to them. Please ask them how you can be present for them. They all need that. Every room I've been in full of Jewish people this week, I've asked, how are you doing? And the answer has just been silence with staring at the floor. And why I wasn't here earlier was my therapist was like, hey, you get a second session this week. So needed that. It's a day a little self-preservation. But so please reach out to your Jewish friends. And if you don't have any Jewish friends, go make a Jewish friend. We're nice people. Thank you. I want to share this prayer from my tradition. May the one who blessed our ancestors bless us with strength and healing as we struggle, or people we love and care about struggle with emotional distress and mental suffering. May we walk in the footsteps of Jacob, King Saul, Miriam, Hannah, and Naomi, who lived with dark moods, feelings of hopelessness, isolation, and terror, but survived and continued to lead their people. Just as our father Jacob spent the night wrestling with an angel and prevailed, may we and those we love be granted the endurance to wrestle with pain and prevail night upon night. Grant us the faith to know that though, like Jacob, we may at times be wounded, shaped, and renamed by our mental struggles, still we live on to continue an ever-unfolding, unpredictable path, hopefully toward healing. May we not be alone on this path, but accompanied by family in all its forms, friends, faith leaders, caregivers, ancestors, and the divine presence of our God. Surround us with loving kindness, grace, and companionship, and spread over us a Sukkot Shalom, a shelter of peace and wholeness. Let us say, Amen.
That was beautiful. Thank you. And our prayers are with you, Rabbi Spector, and your congregation and all your people. I invite you all to go to lunch. You can go up and down the table on both sides. If you requested gluten-free, vegetarian, other things, they're marked in separate containers. So please don't take a container unless you've said you had an allergy or you needed something specific for your dietary needs. But we will come back here at 1 o'clock to hear the musical number from John Schmidt from the Piano Guys. So please take this time to visit and meet your neighbors, and thank you for being here and enjoy your lunch.